Welcome to Color Light Motion, created and hosted by Victoria Vesna. I'm Bess Rocklitzer, president of the David Bermant Foundation. Today, we will hear from George Quasha. George is an artist, poet, musician, and writer. It was my honor to meet George in 2015 when he was in residency at our foundation. Please enjoy.
Thank you, Bess. Always. It's wonderful to have the kind of support the foundation has to both the artists who were in the collection, who are beyond, and your continued support means a lot to us. I would also like to thank Carol Hobson, director of Harvest Works. Harvest Works is our partner on this series of Color Light Motion. And this is now being beamed at the Governor's Island, where there's an exhibition that's called The Process, and it's part of the Art and Tech exhibition that's done annually at the Governor's Island. It's going to keep going. I highly recommend to everybody who's in New York to go check it out. This particular episode is so exciting to me and to all of us who have been preparing for it, because George invited Gary Hill, who he has been collaborating with for many years. And a lot of you are probably familiar with Gary's work. He's considered a pioneer, and his video works and technology works bring poetic ideas, and he works in a way that the medium gets lost in the conceptual, flexible ways, and addressing issues of consciousness and mirror psychological spaces. And he has been awarded many, many prizes and honors, probably most notably the prize for sculpture at the Venice Biennale, and then the MacArthur Fellowship Award. His bio is too long to go through, but we're delighted to have you, Gary. Welcome. And we're also being joined by Tony Dove, who was featured a couple of episodes ago. Tony did not know Gary or George, but I'm so happy that they're connected, because they're, as you will see at the end of George's presentation, their work and their thinking let's just say that their thinking comes together in really interesting, complex ways, and yet the work is done in very different ways. And that's what's so exciting about having George invite Gary and Tony. So thank you, George, for bringing us all together. And thank you, Carol, for beaming it at the Governor's Island. And it's all yours, George.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm deeply honored to be here among such luminaries, including you, Victoria. Your work has been very deeply important. And of course, Gary and I have been collaborating for decades. And I get to meet Tony Dove, whose work I admire vicariously. I haven't had the pleasure of being there for her actual presentations, but I've studied them a little tiny bit. And this is very exciting. And I'm glad that you trapped me into doing this.
One way of putting it.
I got to recall the fantastic visit with you and Jim Jimjuski and Susan Quasha at the Vermont Foundation in the original site. And actually, the work that I'm just going to briefly refer to as a starting point here, the work of Eric Orr, is, I've only seen it there. I've never seen it otherwise. And I never got to meet him, unfortunately, even though I gather from our friend in common, Carolee Schneemann, that he was in our area. So I missed a big one. But I really think Eric Orr is a major artist. I mean, an artist certainly for me of great importance. I'm going to show this little 2-minute trailer for his work. Says it better than I can. So here we go.
It's cold now. I'm allowed to think?
Yeah, I mean,
oh no! Oh no!
Expounded the idea of the absurd.
but we used to have lines going all the way out the door.
We weren't homeless.
I just don't like this. I mean, if you're going to cook cookies, then I'll come over.
Eric was terrifically literate.
Check into the hotel, go for a swim.
It was a laboratory.
And he was there.
Take it right here. No, left here. Then we start laughing.
He traveled across Burma in a balloon.
You know, I had no idea that there were 1,000 spaceships like mine around with artists in them doing these things in their little dingy places. It was just like an infestation of a great deal of creative people doing far out things.
I tilt towards the very simple, strong, compelling object rather than some other kind of object that has a lot of things on it.
His father, he had a string of legitimate businesses and he had a string of illegitimate businesses. Eric was Mr. Orr's boy, and Eric could do anything he wanted.
That kind of sensibility coming out of a man-made object. What do they put into these things? And so it's part of that sensibility of investing or imbuing a inanimate object with something else. And I frankly do not know what I'm living in. I do not know what this is. And there are many things that are unexplainable to me.
So this is one of the works that, it's another manifestation of the one that's at the original site of the Vermont Foundation. And it has to do with water and fire happening simultaneously in the same place. And the one at Vermont Foundation, for environmental reasons, they couldn't have the fire going on. But that's the work. And so why Eric Orr, a California artist associated with light and space and that whole group of Larry Bell and Robert Irwin and James Turrell? But actually his work is much more in another direction than the association with him would suggest. He was a kind of a Buddhist, a special kind of Buddhist, sort of associated with Tibetan Buddhism. And he identified with Chogyam Trungpa's notion of crazy wisdom, which combines his basic interest in what Buddhists think of as emptiness, or the technical word is shunyata, which means that things are by their nature empty. And he was always trying to find out how things could be both empty and completely embodied in themselves and fully involved with their elemental quality, their power as elements. And so he worked with the elements, and he worked with finding ways that could bring this internal reality out. So that's sort of more like tantric Buddhism and shamanism than the early kind of Buddhism that he's normally said to be associated with. He liked to work with these materials in a kind of tantric, alchemical way, actually, with stone, fire, metal, and then adding gold and blood and bone and radio parts. In some pieces, he would mix blood in with paint. And that would allow him to let the viewer see the paint, but not the blood. So they would find out that blood was contained. So they would have blood in the mind. And that recalls the fact that in Eastern versions of the elements, there are not 4, but 5 elements, and particularly in the Tibetan approach, the 5th element, besides our normal 4, unlike the Chinese, is space. And space is what he worked in, but space also means mind. So when you have the blood in mind, you're actually engaged with one of the elements. So that's not a conceptual thing. That's a physical thing for him. For him, having blood physically there was very important, not just the idea. So not a conceptual artist. He's an artist of what I call principle, which I hope that'll come out a little bit, what that means as we go through here. So I learned about him through Thomas McEvely, in his great book, Sculpture in the Age of Doubt, which, if you want to know about Eric, or you can't do better than to go to that essay in his book. So we're doing, making a reference here to a kind of art, and that kind of art is what I call psychonautic art. It's art that affects us in such a way that we are on a journey with it. We don't meaningfully come to a conclusion about it. We have our thoughts, we engage the concepts, we combine it with every other kind of thing that we can think and every other artist. But the point is not the comparison. It's not the art historical moment. It's not the conceptual side of it. It's not finding an interpretive relationship to it. It's the direct experience itself that he's after. And he would confuse you about what you could know about these things. So a couple of great quotes from Eric Orr. I like to hunt the void. I have used silence, emptiness, and night vision to apprehend my undifferentiated friend. It's a kind of shamanic notion. So he says, I made contact with shamans in Zaire by using my shadow finger against their shadow arms. Now, you have to figure out what that means. I won't say that I know. He also says that what I really want is that when you enter that space, you're completely changed. You experience ecstasy or something. I altogether have no idea about not liking change. So Eric Orr wanted to reach a kind of a 0 point in which all of our assumptions and all of our relationships to the elemental forces would bring us to a kind of 0 point. He loved the idea of zero. I also work with the notion of 0 point, because 0 point is the point at which we can reframe everything, because we've let everything go and we've gotten down just to the basic place of being. Now, I'm not going to say a whole lot about this, but I think that Victoria, Gary Hill, and Tony Dove all in one way or another are engaged in work that is transformative. That is the little rubric that I like to give to things. You go in as yourself and you come out as other, would in some way apply to their work. Now, in Gary's case, which I'll come to now, for a brief little minute, just to acknowledge my deep connection with him and to point out that the issues that we're talking about are very much engaged in his work as well as the others that I mentioned, but in a particular way. I've written more about Gary's work than any other thing I've written about over a period of many years. And this book that you see now, hopefully on the screen, An Art of Limina, is the work that I worked with Charles Stein, poet Charles Stein, and we all collaborate with Gary in performance and in working out these statements about his work. This exploration of the work contains many of the things that I would say, and I was very interested in preparing this and going back and looking at that book, looking back into that book after quite a long time, that much of what I would think and what I would say at this point, in one way or another, is actually talked about in that book. So I'm going to make the distinction as we go through here about what I call principle. In that book, I lay out a 3 principles: axiality, liminality, configuration. And not to get too theoretical here, I just want to say that everything finds its center to keep balance. If you get off center, you fall over. And that's true of almost everything that's in the state of gravity. So axiality is a core interest that we never acknowledge. It's what I call principle. And Eric Orr made this great statement about he was interested in bringing forward what you can't see, making somehow available to you the invisible. And that applies to a situation like the blood is in the paint. You don't see it, but somehow you discover that it's there, whatever means. So we're talking here about a principle is not always on the surface. It can be on the surface. Gravity is a big principle of physics, for instance. And we'll talk about maybe some other principles as we go along here. But Axiality has to do with how we maintain our awareness in space and time. That's what the technical name for that in physiology, neurophysiology, is proprioception. And I'll be talking about that, how we know ourselves. There are receptors, neurological receptors throughout the body that do nothing but help us know who we are, how you find your nose in the dark, all the unconscious things that we do that keep us aware of who and what we are. So let's go to a little bit about Gary Hill's actual work. I'm just going to refer to one piece for the moment, a piece back that I saw back in 1992 when I was at the Stedelijk Museum, and they had asked me to write an essay, which is the first of the big essays that I wrote on Gary that became The Art of Living, a book. And so just say a little bit like what you're looking at right here. So this is a long hall that's completely dark. You go into this hall and you see these, not what you see on this screen, but these tiny little figures in the distance, sort of distant people. They're equally spaced from each other. There can be 16 of them, projections. The technology, by the way, is very basic and primitive. I think you use these surplus elements that cause the projection to these lenses and things to make these things happen. The images are not sharp. They're kind of fuzzy, little ghost-like. And in this 90-foot thing, you go along, and when you come in front of one of these images and try to start to look at it, it gets up, which turns out to be a person getting up and walking toward you. And the person comes and stands right in front of you. Let's see if we can get a couple of those images of what a person looks like. So yeah, so he'll come up and stand in front of you. And the eerie thing about it, which I remember vividly from the first time that I saw it, actually the first time I saw it, I think was probably in the Biennale at the Whitney. And you get a strange feeling that this person is actually there. They're sort of nervous, like a little bit like standing in front of you and shifting around maybe. And because here's a person just standing there doing nothing, looking originally at a camera, but seemingly looking at you. And you have to develop a relationship with this kind of crazy abstract situation of this person who you don't see so sharply, but they feel so terribly real. And so you enter into a kind of proprioceptive relationship with it, which I call coproprioceptive or ecoproprioceptive, by which I mean that your sense of yourself, of how you orient in time and space and how you know yourself, suddenly gets extended to another person or situation or being, or it could be a tree, it could be a cat. If you have a relationship with animals, you know very well that you get into these altered states of interaction with the animals. And that kind of happens in this piece in a strange way. And I'd like to tell you, it's about, you think you know people, and then you start to get this strange feeling of unfamiliarity. Heraclitus said we are estranged from what is most familiar. But that's the human condition, that we keep coming upon this, something very familiar, but we are estranged from it. So what is this? And you can see it that, well, for example, when I heard when we were in the Whitney that Woody Allen had come to see this piece, and he was so freaked out by it that he ran out the door. And there was another moment of that, my collaborator, Charles Stein, when he was in that space, he overheard people in the dark. You don't see the people, you barely can know they're there. You have these human sounds going on, and people do start talking. So these people started talking, and they started saying, oh, this is by Gary Hill. And he did this really amazing piece called Why Do Things Get in a Muddle? Now, Charles Stein, Chuck was in that piece Gary made here on this property back in those days, the 80s or whatever. But so Chuck had to learn to speak backwards. And so that when you replayed the backward language, it would now be regular language, but it would be very strange language. And some parts of it were extremely strange. they got better at it toward the end. So when you open the piece, it seems like it's almost like human language. It is human language, but it's very, very weird. So they were talking about this piece, and Chuck overheard this, and he goes into the voice that he used in the piece and imitates the way it came back when he says, "We will talk about war another time." And the people were totally freaked and left the piece. They were on the edge of what, Tony Dove in her piece was talking about a little bit about what's called the uncanny valley, which is where people get involved with these technological situations, robotic, AI, and it gets very real. And first you kind of appreciate it, you love it, but the more you're with it, the stranger it becomes that you're having this human reaction to what is obviously not entirely human. So, okay, that's what I wanted to say about that. So now let's go to what I call axial. So this is a collection, this is the cover of the book on these axial stones. And they embody the principle of axiality because these stones are just balanced. This big stone you see here is quite large, and I have difficulty holding it and lifting it, but I was able to find this extremely precarious point. And because I've given multiple exhibitions with the stones, I have to do it each time, and it always comes out a little different, but this is the best instance of it. And these are, I'll give you just a couple of quick examples of what I call axial drawings that are also a little bit covered in that book, but mostly not. And these are drawings that are done from the body, from the middle of the body, not the way people draw, which is from the top of the body and cognitive element controlling very precise drawing. But when you make art from the center of your body, you enter into a very different kind of proprioceptive state between you and the medium. And you get into this dialogical relationship with it that is quite powerful. So, and difficult to manage. So these are what color is in the left hand, and the black element was in the right hand. And now we see the ones when I go to full color. And these are ones that I have multiple brushes of ink, it could be either ink or it can be acrylic paint in the left hand, and multiple colors of a few brushes in the right hand. There can be several different brushes altogether. And this works from the center of the body. And in this particular series, it's called the Dakini Duende series. So I enter into, I'm listening to, in this particular series, I'm listening to flamenco music because I'm very, very tuned into flamenco. And the state of duende is this state of embodiment that happens in the duende when it really, when the flamenco dance really happens. And at this point, I visualize the dancer in the distance. I see it becomes a very particular dancer, and I enter into the motion of the dancer. My body proprioceptively or coproprioceptively enters into alignment with this imagined dancer, and I become the dancer inside my own body, listening to the music. And at a certain point, it happens, the drawing happens. And this is the series that happened in that particular modality. So here they are, more of these. It's these dakinis, they do that to you. They come for you, you know? You have to develop a very special relationship with them. Otherwise, you could be in danger. So art is a kind of protection against them. So this is what they look like. Okay. Now I'm going to give you, this is what they look like when they become book covers from Susan Quasha's wonderful designs. And she picks one of the drawings and then works on it. This is 3 of the 7 books of preverbs, which is the art form that I primarily have practiced for the last 23 years. And they're acts of language that I may talk about at some point, but it is my main work, but it's a little hard to present in this context. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how the axial process works, just briefly. So that's the axial stones, how they come about. And this is just a brief look at the axial drawings. This principle, beauty equals precarious by optimal, that our sense of beauty somehow finds a place between what is on edge, what we don't know, what could be strange, what is, in this case, precarious, and what is optimal for this moment. And that becomes something very beautiful when you come to appreciate it. This is sort of my earlier way of working. The first drawing that I showed you, which was flat on a table, they were done that way. But all of the others, the colored ones, the Dakini Duende ones, are down on the wall, and it's kind of a dance with some of them in front of that wall. Okay, I'll stop there. And go onward. So now I'm going to take you to a different dimension of what I call the axial and what the issues are. Just to backtrack a little bit, in Tony Dove's work, she talked about refining AI to the point where the interaction between what she produces and what the person standing in front does goes beyond the monkey see, monkey do mirror thing. Part of proprioception is what they are now calling mirror neurons, which is what happens when another person yawns, for instance, and you can't resist yawning. It's where we recognize something in another person that brings us into it. It's one of the neurological bases of the profound experience of empathy that isn't handled by the neurological thing, but that's the trigger. That's what happens on the physical basis. So this mirroring process with this otherness, what I call mirroring by alterity, mirroring by engagement with what is radically other. In that case, of course, technology is that, but then your own work can be that. Something you're making, you get this feedback from it. So proprioception is really based on feedback, and ecoproprioception is on the feedback that this now has with the environment, with the surround, how we identify with it, pull back from it, go back and forth between these different states. We can produce an effect in the environment through our way. We do produce an effect in the environment by this interactive principle, because what you're getting from the other person, they might be getting from you as well. And so there's this radical connection. So what happens? Do we have an effect? Does our mind have an effect? We're always concerned about what is the person going to experience in looking at the work? Typically, traditionally in art, people perfect the medium so that it has the effect, the intended effect. Those of us who work with art in a more process-oriented way don't have a bag of tricks that make people respond in a very particular way. We create working with whatever principle we're working with, we arrange the materials so that we can confine and constrain and bring an event about, but we can't predict the effect of the event. We're actually discovering that. And so the ways, for instance, that Victoria works with Jim Dimjewski in art and science indicates the interface between art and science, where you're looking for something. You're trying to find out what the effect is. You're both demonstrating something, a principle that you know to exist, but in working with it in a particular way, you're trying to find out how this can create something of interest, and hopefully something that is somewhat transformative in the Eric Orr sense of the person in the artwork, but in a direction that awakens them to an awareness that is very, very important. When I was preparing the last time I had a talk with Victoria formally for her Art Sci process, I was going to talk about this principle with her. And in that afternoon, I was outside, and for some reason I started thinking about hummingbirds. And I remember that we'd seen a hummingbird out there, and in this particular, this plant. So I walked by the plant, I look at the plant. Nice, it would be nice if the hummingbird were here, but it's not. So I go and do what I have to do, and I come back. And as I come back and approach that plant, a hummingbird comes in front of me, and it comes maybe a few feet, just a couple of feet from my face, and just stops in front of my head and looks at my face as though somehow he was answering my request. And that put me right at that edge. If it were a non-living thing, I might go to the uncanny valley edge. But if it's nature, you say, oh, this is a privilege. I'm getting to engage this being, whatever it is. You're left with the feeling, did I make this happen? Did thinking make this happen? Did the hummingbird make it happen? Was something else involved in this? You never can answer this kind of question. So it's better not to answer the question, because the situation is so profoundly like art itself that it's a situation you can only engage with letting go your attempt to interpret it and just appreciate it for what it is and see where that takes you. So I wanted to get there in speaking to people. I was thinking that, can I get a person to go to the state of really kind of openness, emptiness, 0 point, about something they absolutely have to talk about by the nature of who they are, but I don't want them to talk about it in a way that they already know. So how do I do that? So I developed a kind of process of doing that. In this work, I asked artists, poets, composers to tell me what it is, but please don't prepare, just come there and let's talk. And I'll pick something from it, so you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to perform anything. Everybody did something very different. In the end, I have filmed over 1,000 artists and poets and composers in 11 countries and in many other languages to the best of my ability. And this project is ongoing at artisinternational.org. That's where we are on the screen at the moment. You'll see there's one of Victoria, some from maybe 12, 13, 14 years ago, right next to Vito Acconci, which was just not long before he died. And these are longer ones with Victoria, so I'm not going to play those. But I will show you just a couple of minutes maybe of Gary Hill and Marina Abramovich, which happen to be right next to each other at this point.
Art is beauty. Undeniably beauty. Breathtaking. Disturbing. Art needs to happen. Art is happening Art is being. Art. Art.
Art is melancholic, pathetic, monstrous, danger, bloody, risky, disturbing, rewarding, dramatic, communistic, sharing, interacting, meditative, secure, smelly, ridiculous, rigorous, fundamental, mystic, shiny, spiritual.
So, just to tell you the story there, when I asked Marina to do this, she said, well, she had done a piece in which she lay back on something and was asked to perform something, and she went into a kind of a dream liminal state, altered state of some kind, and she just said whatever came to mind. And would I be able to do that? I said, well, the problem is that my camera wants to look right in your face. So we had to put her back on a kind of a bed situation, and I had to get the cameras up above her so that it's actually looking kind of down at her, a little bit like this angle. And she went into the state, and this is only like half of it. The other half's in Artist 2, the second volume of this. So this is about the different modalities of expression people can be in, and how a one-time engagement, something that will never ever happen again in exactly the way the person is speaking, when they're in a state of high particularity, singularity, it's just this. It may be induced by a request like this to ask Gary and ask Marina to say what art is in whatever way they wish. People come with very different ways. Victoria's is very much a kind of, the way she is, a kind of honest, straightforward, careful assessment of what she thinks. No, pulling no punches, just saying it. And so each is a state of discourse, a state of being, a state of mind. And you can see how the language and the state of mind producing the language are very, very special. So what is ordinary and what is extraordinary? What is non-ordinary? How is the extraordinary or non-ordinary hidden deep inside the ordinary? That would be Eric Orr's question. It would be also many other artists' question. So the brain knows when it's engaged with something that is real. When you're looking at this, your brain is recognizing that this is not something that was rehearsed. It knows this in both the cases of what you saw with Gary. So out of this question of, can I get people to show me states, interesting alternative states of mind, being, language through portraiture, I produced a number of different kinds of works. There were these 1,000 encounters with artists and poets, and then there were some very particular ones that I set up. Now, the one that I'm going to show you now, just a couple of minutes of it because it's very long. It's like 16 minutes. This is this piece is called "I Don't Understand Language," and in this piece, I did a couple of pieces which I got a number of different people to say the paradoxical words, I don't understand language, speaking in language and saying I don't understand language, and getting in touch with that you can know language very well, but you can't claim to understand it. And how does that come forward? Well, in the following videos, very brief little snippets I'm going to give you, we'll see different versions of that. So this is Mari. She's going to speak in English and in Georgian, not a Slavic language, a language in a very, very its own little category. And here we go. She's 9 years old, by the way. So this was done many years ago. Because she's now about 30. So.
I don't understand language. Man, 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 I don't understand language.
So it goes on, it gets slower and slower and weirder and weirder. And there are thresholds in this of such incredibly interesting weirdness. When you get inside the actual language, obviously no longer sounding like her, but what is it? And we can say, oh, well, that's kind of obvious. But when I dare you, watch it all the way through. It has a very, very strange effect. I don't do it very often myself because it's too strange. So here's another instance of language that I'll play you a little bit of. I'll tell you about it afterward.
Heart, 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 hard, heart, hard, heart, hard, 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 heart, heart, hard, heart, hard, 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 heart, hurt, 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 art, hurt.
So okay, this is Chie Hasagawa, now Hammonds. She's married to David Hammonds now, and she's Japanese, and she always had trouble with certain sounds, which is the problem of speaking two languages when one of them you learned quite a bit later. And so one of the sounds, obviously, it's very difficult for her is the sound. It's many different cultures have a problem with that sound, so important to particularly American English, And so she's trying to get that straight, and it goes on for a couple of minutes or so. But for instance, Victoria would understand this situation. People who have grown up speaking more than one language, you hit these interface points that are actually the liminality between whole cultures, whole ways of being and ways of speaking, ways of mind. They're very, very difficult to reduce to abstraction. They're at the experiential level that's below the radar. We don't quite get how the struggle is there. So here we have the ecoproprioception here is in the distance between languages, how you embody an entirely different culture when you're speaking in a different language. Anybody who's learned another language well enough to have complete conversations and whole days and weeks maybe where they're not speaking their native language knows how this takes you over, and how if you're away from it for a long time, the language phenomenon kind of drifts away from you. You have to get it back again. So, all right, that's telltale heart. It's that eruptive lingual sound, things trying to get through, which is what's happening when what I'm doing now. I'm trying to say the right thing in the right period of time and make it happen just right. It's always this inner struggle to bring to language what is there. And you take that away and you lose what language is. So when I put people in the art is in a situation where almost a vast number of them would say, I don't know what art is. I could never say what art is, but I'll say this. And it's sort of like that. It's a little bit of a compromise, something that you must be saying in your own mind if you're an artist or a poet. You're constantly coming to, oh, well, this is what it is. So this feels right. But then that drifts away and you come to another thing. So that struggle. Now we will get to another kind of struggle. Equally interesting. I'll tell you about this after you are hit by it.
I feel like my mouth isn't working right. It's so funny. I feel actually that why is it like I feel like chi, or whatever you call the feeling of naturalness of moving through you, like whenever I feel slightly with my mouth, like I'm having to move my mouth around letters like more than necessary. I feel like this strange relationship to my mouth. Like, am I not saying the truth well enough? Like, am I not speaking the full force of my energy? Am I only speaking from my mouth? Like, am I not speaking from my heart or this deeper place in my mind where my mouth just naturally moves on its own? I think when I speak from a certain place in my mind, like a more frontal, self-conscious place, then it's my mouth, like the way I around letters, it's like it's so conscious of its own action that it like I feel like it's hard to just go and go through it and speak. It's like this
So this is Alon Siegel, a very wonderful poet and friend. This goes back about 15 years or so. And the Telltale Heart was back to 2006, so that's a really old one. This was 2008. The struggle is physiological, how you identify your own body and your own condition with language, and how that feeds back into how you question your own integrity or your own ability, your own status as a person communicating. So these are reflective feedback moments. And then the art aspect of it, of making these into portraits, these axial portraits, takes the feedback to another level, where we're watching her in this very intimate kind of inquiry. Okay, I'm going to very briefly give you two tiny examples of a proprioceptive engagement with matter through a camera. In this case, the axiality and the proprioception has to do with finding the balance point. The balance point with the stones is an intimacy with stone. There, I'm surrendering to the stones to let whatever they're willing for. I don't force them. I don't change the stones. I don't make them happen if they're not really willing for it to happen. So you get into this odd state in which you're kind of treating stone as if it's alive. And it's the only way to do it. You have to give it that quality of aliveness. You have to grant it this thing. So whether or not one can find justification for thinking that it's alive in any kind of rational world, nevertheless, it's part of you to assume life in otherness when it's strange. And that's what's going to come to coming very much to the fore with AI. It's getting weirder and weirder. But it's a deep problem that doesn't start with AI or doesn't start with technology. It's there in us. And that's very important to recognize. In order to get our relationship with AI and all of that in a meaningful way, I really think we need to study, first of all, how we are without it. Like studying the body, studying ourselves, how thinking and being are very much involved in what you already have going for you. So these are what I call their axial landscapes, because the landscape is stable, but the camera is moving. Sometimes it's moving if I'm on a train, sometimes it's moving different kinds of ways. In this case, very peculiar one, I dangled the camera from a strap and generate a kind of axial movement with my body, very much like the axial drawings. Only I'm not producing something that's point specific, it's situation specific. And I'm not seeing what I'm getting here. It's only when I bring it out and then slow it down radically that I can see the interstices where a certain synesthesia occurs in these that I will talk about maybe. So that's that particular one. And I'm going to quickly go into another one. This one is far more dramatic. And this is what I call passionate paper. But the name of the piece is Pulp Friction. So, Pulp Friction, basically, obviously, it was a situation that has no story, no narrative whatsoever. It's all material, all body, all motion. It's a full performative engagement with art pulp, which is a strange kind of paper. It was created by a Fluxus artist, Alison Knowles, for making sound in performance. That's one of her main art forms, and she's given me several of these pieces that are fantastic. She used it in a performance situation, which I didn't attend across the country. But for me, it was about, can what I see through the camera actually become body, become physical? Can it engage me with the issues of the body that can happen by a kind of passionate engagement with the material? It has a kind of configurative erotics. It has a kind of sculptural quality. And it's both abstract and very concrete. I'm very interested in for years, we've talked about whether art is figurative or whether it's abstract in painting, for instance. I'm interested in configurative art. which isn't limited to, can be painting, can be it configures as it goes, and you can never really decide the itness of it. And that's the state of engagement. The rhythmic, tactile engagement overpowers the interpretive mechanism of our minds through this ecoproprioceptive feedback relationship that we're getting. So now I'm going to, in the remaining time, I hope I haven't tested the limits of your patience too much, but I will go about 8 minutes over my time.
Oh, don't worry about it. We're enjoying the pulp friction.
Yeah, right.
It's amazing how erotic it is, or is it just in my head?
Oh, yeah. Well, Victoria, now you see how we eat. Oh, really?
That's my brain, sorry.
When we talk about these things, I mean, that's the whole idea, to bring forward these confused and confusing impulses and sensations in relationships that we have that have no name. We can call it erotic because it engages certain kinds of erotic. If you watch the whole thing, it's very erotic. It starts out very, very quiet, with just different relationships to the paper, but it gets there. And all these videos have a temporal effect that I can't show you in these short little snippets of how they affect one over time. That's the big deal for me. So I'm going to give you 2 little snippets from this axial lecture on self-orientation. So self-orientation is, in a way, another name before I created the term ecoproprioception. This goes back to 2010. And it's a presentation that was for our friends, Arakawa, great Japanese American artist, and his partner, Madeline Gens, whose book we had published way back in the 80s, What the President Will Say and Do. And she wrote and conceptualized in English the vast amount of what we know to be Arakawa, other than what his actual constructions. And then their eventually moving into architecture and creating spaces in which are transformative spaces, in which being in them, they're works of ecoproprioception, very, very challenging works where you have to relate to the environment in this continuously changing way. There were very unstable moments. No one has much lived in those. They thought that it would bring about life extension if you lived in these kinds of environments. That's a whole complex issue. But anyway, this was a conference held at Barnard, New York, honoring them. And this is what I did for that conference, engaging the principles that I've mentioned. So it'll be 2, basically 4 to 5 minute plus a little bit sections. I'll stop it and go to the other one when we get to.
This is a lecture, or maybe talk, happening in real time. Even though, according to the lecture talk itself, time is not real. I am here talking to you, even though, according to the talk lecture, I'm at this very moment reading to you. I just said at this moment, even though, according to the lecture, or maybe talk, which is not actually a talk, I said time is not real. To make matters worse, I am talking, or as it were, not talking to you in real space, this actual space where I stand looking out and not seeing you. But I don't mean to say to you that I'm not talking to you. I wouldn't want you to take this wrong. I have nothing against talking to you, and I don't actually prefer reading to you. The occasion of my being here, born of the desire to celebrate the powerful transformative work of Arakawa and Madeline Gens, calls for precise distinctions and an appropriate mode of discourse that I would not be sure of creating in an actual talking situation. I'm not David Anton. I'm not even Charles Bernstein, who's here in the dark somewhere. So I thought of calling this a writing piece, or maybe just writing. But That wouldn't cover the proposed interruption of time and space that I intend by the word lecture, which at root, of course, comes from Latin legere, to read. If I call this a talk, you might not be bothered if I read to you, especially if you're living the academic life. But after David Anton, I wouldn't dare. And yet, even the term lecture is far from accurate, given my intention of carrying this discourse into places I consider more appropriate to the transformative implications of Arakawa Gens, if I may say their two names, as many do, as if they were one person, which of course they are not, but then neither does it feel right to speak of them as two, since, after all, the many ways they create a single work, or perhaps a single multiple, or maybe a multiple singularity moving unitedly in its very mode of unbounded singleness. This raises the problem of identity, which of course comes from the Latin neuter idem, which even non-academics know means the same. And these two people are definitely not the same, any more than they're neuter. But according to this indefinitely represented semi-communicative discourse, identity is no more real than time or space. That is, the category real is hardly adequate to contain all the things that we actually experience in relation to them, such that they are. Let's go back in time. Or let's go back to time. Well, we can't actually go back to time any more than we can go back in time, which so far we can't. That is, we can't go back to anything without believing in time, which according to this composition, I don't really believe in, at least not wholeheartedly. I'm trying to say this in a very straightforward way, but the difficulties of creating a precise discourse worthy of celebrating Arakawa Gens, that wonderful self-varying sameness that persons, throws curveballs inside communication. Or maybe a better metaphor would be the need to keep many balls in the air at once, or, forgive me, many curveballs. Anyway, time. You know what I mean. Most of the time, when I say time, we depend on it, which is an act of confidence that doesn't require a special act of belief. Even without believing in time, we do fairly well handling time issues. And rest assured that even though I don't believe in time, I respect it and hope that my timing isn't off and that I stick within my time limits here today. And I hope you'll still be talking to me, even if we're not sure in what sense I'm still talking to you. In this respect, time is perspectival, like space. How long we stand, where we stand, and what we perceive. No matter how much we challenge the reality of time and space, they bounce back into relatively stable position in our experience. We can both doubt them and yet rely on them for basic orientation. What steps, if the words be given to themselves, what steps? And if it is hearing between even the fastest beats,
I'm kind of blown away sitting here right now because I haven't really seen an overview of George's work probably ever in that sense. I've seen, most of these works, if not all of them, in some form or another. But to see it presented like this is certainly an awakening for me. George has a way with words, and words have a way with George. He's also kind of obsessed with making words, making composites of words or combinations of words that are almost like kind of origami or something. Like if you try to kind of unfold these words to deconstruct them, they twist up again. Maybe this has something to do with his preverbs later on. I'm on the West Coast, and the starting of this was just a few hours after I get up and orientate myself. And I was kind of pacing and the floor and thinking about George and just, all kinds of things, because we've known each other for 45 years or something. And I was, how you wander and you look at things, and I was just kind of scanning a bookshelf here, and I saw there was a very thin pamphlet, something, a very thin book. It was between two other books. And for some reason, I pulled that out, which I hadn't seen this in, I don't know how many years, but this is some kind of excerpt of something that George wrote in 1976, 1977. And literally, you have to understand, I just pulled this out, one thing out of a book of, hundreds of books this morning. And I just want to read you just 2 sentences in here. Let's see. I mean, it's definitely worth reading the whole thing, but can't do that, obviously. He says, if any abstraction remains in my mind after engaging the text of the quote unquote new poetry, it's that the poetic is not a privileged and specialized use of language, but language itself in the act of being true to itself. The quote unquote use of the poetic is the activity it makes inevitable, the further languaging in our discourse. So 50 years ago or whatever, George seemingly took this hunk of wet clay and, metaphorically threw it on the potter's wheel, and has been centering this idea for all these years in just infinite numbers of ways. It makes me think of Lamont Young's saying tuning is a function of time. And so George, sitting actually in a circular dome room right now, is like he's on the potter's wheel himself. And he's, just in this process of tuning, continuously tuning. It's about all I can say so much more, but I'm going to turn it over to Tony.
I agree. I think one of the things that really struck me, and this is the first time, this is my introduction to George's work, is I think what I'm going to call the impossibility of boundaries of this. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of what I think that means, the sense of the impossibility of boundaries. The first has to do with, George, you mentioned something about the uncanny valley, and the fact that I had mentioned that. And the uncanny valley is a term that's used often in robotics, where when an object is similar, is human-like, it's comic, it produces empathy, we feel a connection to it until it gets so close to us that it's almost there but not quite, and then it becomes profoundly disturbing. And then the next step is that it is the thing itself. So I'm thinking about like two kind of sliding scales of being and becoming that seem to be operating in the work. And the first is that notion of the uncanny, of the way it becomes strange or is you. And the other, I think, probably the easiest way to explain it is to think in terms of Bergson's notion of affect and perception, and because he separates those two things, and he thinks of affect as a kind of vividness, the sense of that we have in our bodies, the feeling that we have that makes us know that we're alive. It's almost like a libidinal charge, that sense of aliveness. And that affect is we carry with us, and perception is a separate function and in Bergson and acts as a form of remote agency. We see the world at a distance, and affect works through perception to then bring the world alive for us, to make that world become vivid. And that strikes me as another kind of sliding scale between the inside and the outside, between us and it, the thing, how, that remote agency is it's a kind of doubling that happens, where you're in your body and you're in the screen, or you're in your body and you're in the object. You're both places at once, and there's a kind of sliding back and forth that's happening that is never fixed, is never in any given one place. And that strikes me, that's like, kind of a profound aspect of your work, which is sometimes performative, sometimes object oriented, sometimes about, the nature of language itself, but it's always operating on these kind of multiple sliding scales where you never quite can fix on it in a way that makes you feel, stable in the work. And that those sliding scales are existing like both inside and outside of time, which I find interesting because they require time to even experience. There has to be some kind of time for you to have that experience, and yet at the same time, that notion of being inside yourself, outside yourself, those things are kind of existential at the same time. They're they exist outside of time. So that's my take. It was really fascinating.
We have two of your good friends here, Raquel and Carter. Raquel, did you want to say something?
I have known George for many years and always felt a profound connection, not only with his person or personality, but his way of thinking and doing, and the way he manifests all this richness of his mind into his artwork. I love his curiosity, his engagement with language, or questioning language in itself. And I remember wonderful dialogues, both in his house, in mine, in my studio. And I just treasure that wonderful connection. And I'm so happy for him today to have been able to show us and share with us through time the many magnificent projects he engaged in. So I want to honor him and love him at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Raquel. Raquel's a fabulous artist, by the way.
Thank you.
Such a nice gift. And Anna, are you coming to us from Poland or where?
Yes, almost. I'm located in Slovakia right now in my village house. So it is actually Polish-Slovak borderland. So, those questions can continue to be, kind of troubling in a way. Which only amounts to, I think, this question of boundaries and borders, and to what extent those borders that seem to be drawn with a thin line on a map are absolutely abstract in a sense that they don't really speak or don't really hold, so to speak. But I was really intrigued to hear George Quasha's beautiful lecture. I loved it. I've known George Quasha's work mostly as a poet because I happen to perform your poems, George, sometimes. Yes, I Know Dreams, that actually I got from Victoria, the book that I got from Victoria. And to me, those poems are really amazing. And now I better understand your whole landscape, so to speak. And I was really I'm still having some troubles to actually articulate and express this space where language is so embodied as well. We tend to think about language and body as, two distinct areas or two distinct spaces. But to me, your work is primarily about language as embodied phenomenon and sort of connecting, a device that would connect the materiality, like stones, right? And the space that is often seen as internal, like dreaming, for example. So I was actually interested in. The question appeared in my mind: to what extent the stones that you're working with, to what extent they can dream, and how you sort of work as a convener of the dreams. So that was something that really struck me in your work and in how you presented it, and that your presentation actually to me was a beautiful dream. Frankly, I was just sitting here and in front of an open window, and I had this outlook towards the vast skies, and the sun was just about to set, and it was in such a perfect composition with your lecture that it became a part of it. So indeed, there are no boundaries between outside, inside, and in between, I would say. So for me, the space of in between, that is something that really speaks to me, the space of in between in your work. So that would be my comments. Thank you so much for your lecture today.
And we're experiencing it very similarly, because I was in fact thinking about the different time zones and the fact that there's East Coast, West Coast, and both of us are experiencing it in this in-between time. I actually had to move in because it's getting dark.
No, I was just saying, I noticed that Caroline Flanneridis is present, I think.
Caroline, fantastic.
And she's quite familiar with.
I know Caroline from ages ago, from another lifetime.
Hi.
Hi, Caroline. How wonderful to have you join.
It was like old home week listening
Yes.
to George. I was thinking of a lot of things, having witnessed Charles Stein and Gary and George kind of monologue over George's work back in the 90s, like 1994. And I kept thinking during George's lecture about still point, being still and moving at the same time, and how much his work has to do. He uses the word balance, but for me, it's kind of being still and moving, having a certain kind of energy all at the same time. I really enjoyed it, George. Thank you. It's the first, like Gary, that was the first time I actually kind of saw this complete, and I know it's not complete, but almost complete explanation of and demonstration of all of your thoughts and ideas. And it was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm just happy to see Caroline.
Speaking about the axial stones. The other thing about that is particularly in the passage we saw, the complete, first of all, the process, and then this, completion. But in that completion, you really have this sense of precariousness of whether it will stay, it will remain, and it's almost part of it. But it could just go anytime. And George, another word or phrase of his invention is the further life of the work. And in this sense, it's like a further life, but it's also the further temporariness of what it is that really emanates from those stones. Completely different than what people do by the seashore or rivers, and they pile stones, just as a fun meditation or whatever. Here we feel just the kind of visceral physicality of possible total destruction or creation at the same time.
You know what Gary is saying about the axial stones, just anecdotally, we don't have too many earthquakes in this part of the world, but occasionally there's a small one. One hardly notices, but it seems to me that George has said that after one of those, he went into a studio where there were a whole cluster of axial stones and they'd all fallen down. And also, if I'm not mistaken, squirrels sometimes come in and make their contribution to the further life of the work. So that precariousness, it's not the only quality, but that's really important to George's work. And there's a certain precariousness putting the work out, because there's no, George's process is always taking him into some new place. And there have been many preverbs, but the preverbs are always different. They always go into new territory. And there's a precariousness there, because for most artists and most writers, once they become, use that word, once they become mature, there's a kind of expectation and a legitimate expectation of what their work is going to be. But because of George's dedication to this ongoing, or I shouldn't say dedication, just living through this ongoing process, there's never falling into that predictability. It's always precarious in a good sense, not in the promise of disaster. Because even when the earthquake knocked the stones down, they could always be reassembled. And just a last thought about the axial stones, to recall something George said, every time he puts them back together, they're different. So there's this ongoing process, and there's never a final work. Perhaps it's true in other cultures, but traditionally in Western culture, work has a kind of finality, and it achieves what it intends to achieve. And very often, going all the way back to the time of the ancient Greeks, that final state was one that was supposed to transcend the ordinary world. Anyway, that's the last thought, that George's living through and living by process is what really makes him unique. That there's no attempt to hit that final moment that produces a static work that then transcends ordinary experience. His processes, as he's explained in so many ways, in so many different mediums, always take us back into the world in the hopes that we'll become more aware of where we are, namely in the world.
Well, I think it's wonderful to have an overview, this thread shown to us, because it's obvious that all of us are in a way surprised because there's a definite connecting thread. And I'm starting to understand also better why you picked Eric Orr's work, where the water and the fire were happening at the same time, and kind of this movement between your body and words, thinking and being in the center while everything around is moving. I don't say chaos. I've been taught to not say chaos by you. And it's also really interesting that this episode is being live at Governor's Island for a show that's called Process. So it really, to me, it's the ultimate of showing how all of life in the artist's life is a process, and the expression of it and the sharing of it, and the fact that you've attracted such a wonderful group of people and two amazing artists, Gary Hill, who you've worked with so long, and Tony, who's a new acquaintance that you actually got interested in by checking out her feature. But also Anna joined, and other people I noticed also, Shola Gazari, and of course Carol Ann Clonarides joined, which is wonderful. So you're certainly an attractor of some good minds, and I'm super pleased. And I'm so happy about the way all of this turned out. So thank you so much. We give our hands at the end of our episodes. Bye, everybody.
A great thing for me. Thank you so much.